I want to welcome everybody to the American Museum of the Cuban Diaspora. This is the place that's quickly becoming the home of the Cuban exile community. This is a place where we had a visit by the legendary Lech Walesa, where a number of heads of state from Latin America have come, where senators and members of Congress, when they have something to say to the Cuban community, come to be able to speak. We recently had Senator Rubio here. We've had Senator Menendez. We've had who we will invite back on December 10th. So it is a place that is open to all of you. This is your home. I see Ambassador Valladares is here from the Inspire America Foundation. And, Don Diego Suárez. Tenemos a nuestra directora ejecutiva, Carmen Valdivia. Estamos vestidos verdaderamente de lujo hoy. So I want to welcome everyone. And I want to say, after the event, we will have some time, if possible, to give you a tour, a behind-the-scenes tour of the exhibit that is being prepared to launch in January, which will be the permanent exhibit of the museum, and it's the entire story of Cuban Americans and Cuban exiles, and hopefully with a little bit of an ending as to where we're going from here. And it's certainly something worth watching. I got to tell you that the folks that have seen it, even under construction, many times come out with a tear in their eye, but with a hopeful point of view of where we're going. Today we have one of these events that is so dear to my heart, because it's not simply a contribution to our community, but it's the contribution of a good and dear friend of mine to our community. Jose Martí had a saying, which I'll try to translate here on the go, which was, by law, the kings and heads of state that pass must render tribute to the thinkers and poets that never pass. I think Dr. Azel is one of those thinkers and those poets. And the thing that you can most appreciate about his writing aren't his usual dissection of philosophers from centuries ago that the majority of the population doesn't know. You have to go up and read and see who he was in the context. Nor the use of this beautiful vocabulary. A lot of people can do that, but it means nothing if it doesn't articulate the right idea. And that is really what I truly believe his gift is, to articulate the right idea in a way that you can understand, and you can understand the entire process of how that affects our lives today, our world today. That's a unique gift. It's a unique gift that I think, I only know of two of my friends that have that level of gift, and the other one is in Spain, Carlos Alberto Montaner and José Azel, great contributors to our way of thinking and to our way of understanding the world. And I could think of no better group to share this presentation with than my two colleagues up here, who I will now yield the floor to so that they can give their impression of our event tonight. The first person I want to invite to say a few words is one of our most gifted academics, professor, author of numerous books, a very acclaimed author. But if you ask him, those are not his greatest accomplishments. His greatest accomplishments is as a Christian minister and his ability to help and assist so many people. Some of you have been here before. You know how I always refer to Don Diego Suárez as el decano del exilio. Pero este no es Diego no es el único decano del exilio. Él tiene su compinche, su gran amigo y hermano, el otro decano del exilio, el doctor Marco Antonio Ramos. Doctor, bienvenido.
I apologize to my dear friends that do not know or do not use the Spanish language. Many years ago, I used to be pastor of churches where the accent was not Cuban accent, it was Southern accent. But I love to be with you, but I'm going to speak in the Spanish language. I'll try to go back to my ancient language. I say ancient because I have a few years, you know. Olivia knows that. Okay. Señoras y señores, amigos todos, sean mis primeras palabras para agradecer las puertas tan abiertas del Museo de la Diáspora Cubana para la presentación de una obra que recoge parte de las extensas labores del profesor y columnista José Azel. Conocía, gracias a mi entrañable e ilustre amigo don Diego Suárez, casi como mi jefe mío políticamente, la magna labor que realiza actualmente el museo, dirigido por el doctor Marcell Felipe, chairman de Inspire America y una de las personas de las cuales podemos decir muchas cosas, pero sobre todo que dependemos en gran parte de él para el futuro de nuestra tierra natal. En los últimos años, pues don Diego y Vilma me han orientado en muchas cuestiones, entre ellas admirar la labor del museo. Entrando en materia, deseo señalar que mi participación de tantos años como investigador del Instituto de Estudios Cubanos y Cubanoamericanos de la Universidad de Miami, entre otras ocupaciones, me permitió trabajar junto al doctor Azel, cuya obra me complace presentar. Me correspondió por muchísimos años la tarea de presentar infinidad de libros de estudios cubanos en el Salón Bacardí del mencionado instituto, dirigido por mi viejo amigo, el doctor Suslikin. A día de hoy, y gracias a ustedes, regreso en cierta forma, brevemente, a aquella actividad que me abrió tantas oportunidades de conocer tanta gente buena. Ante nosotros una colección de ensayos que constituyen la generosa entrega a nuestras manos de la labor más erudita y actualizada posible sobre el tema de la libertad en el entorno que nos ha tocado vivir. Sobre ese tema mucho se escribe, pero sin recordar que vivimos en otros tiempos. Son otros tiempos y otros hombres, como decía mi querido amigo el doctor Rafael Guajinclán. A mi generación, que es la misma del doctor Azel, le correspondió vivir los años de la adolescencia y primera juventud como testigos de una inundación de materiales ideológicos que, a pesar de ser desviaciones totalitarias, no dejaban de relacionarse de alguna manera con cierta tendencia al estatismo y quizá hasta al socialismo, procedentes de un ambiente en el cual, por ejemplo, se le decía a alguien como un elogio, el joven revolucionario fulano de tal, este personaje de ideas avanzadas, elogio frecuente de una prensa que pronto sería calificada de burguesa y proimperialista. Hasta un partido claramente democrático y que tomó grandes medidas anticomunistas al ocupar el poder, pues proclamaba en su programa ser nacionalista, socialista y antiimperialista. Algunos de nosotros, tal vez por circunstancias familiares, nunca simpatizamos con la revolución, ni siquiera antes de llegar al poder. Pero vivimos en aquellos primeros años con los libros que se repartían, Fundamentos del Socialismo en Cuba, de Blas Roca, publicado originalmente en 1943, pero ahora presentado con ciertos cambios, los manuales soviéticos que se vendían eran casi gratuitos para que la gente los leyera. Todo eso son recuerdos que tenemos. Y luego, sin embargo, después vinimos a Estados Unidos y aquí en Nueva York, en Europa, en la ciudad de Miami, leíamos artículos y libros que en realidad, aunque no eran de ideología comunista, pero que resonaban casi como tales. Y eso ha continuado y se ha identificado. Pero las columnas escritas por José Azel no solo le hacen frente a cuestiones de actualidad, sino que llegan a lo profundo de los temas relacionados con los cambios que se han producido, el incremento del estatismo, y ha enfrentado todo eso con esa capacidad que tiene de comunicarse. Yo soy uno de sus más fieles lectores. No, yo soy un lector absolutamente fiel porque yo he leído todo lo que tú has escrito. El gran tema de la libertad lo enfrenta de una manera impresionante y al mismo tiempo no se limita a expresar opiniones contrarias a un gobierno o a un partido, porque este asunto no puede reducirse a sustituir a un gobernante o a un sistema por otro. Hay cosas mucho más profundas que van quedando en el ambiente. Para introducir lo que él ha tenido en mente en sus cientos de artículos, especialmente en estos 100 ensayos, me impresionan. Introducir esto es acudir a un prólogo que escribió mi viejo amigo Carlos Alberto Montaner, quien hace resaltar que la libertad no es un subproducto de la prosperidad, sino que la libertad es la causa de la prosperidad. Azel nos muestra que no puede haber prosperidad, ni buen gobierno, ni un grado apreciable de felicidad en la vida sin la imposición correcta y adecuada, sin temor alguno, de la libertad. A veces la libertad, y tal vez él no esté de acuerdo conmigo, hay que imponerla. En estos 100 ensayos se produce el milagro de lograr tantas cosas. Estudios que incluyen historia, filosofía, las ciencias sociales y la realidad diaria. Se señala con esa claridad que le caracteriza las raíces de los problemas. Acude a la experiencia de los fundadores de la nación y de grandes pensadores de este tiempo y de todos los tiempos. Sí, todo eso lo encontramos en estos ensayos. Después de tantos años, medio siglo de profesor de historia en instituciones universitarias y de estudios teológicos, este viejo investigador que, como decía el doctor Felipe, ha escrito infinidad de libros, porque me enseñaron que era mejor escribir muchos libros, porque así si eran muchos, la gente no se daba cuenta que malos eran. Es decir, calidad reemplazada por cantidad. Y yo confieso que todos esos artículos que yo escribí en el diario Las Américas, por alrededor de 40 años, en el Nuevo Herald por 10 años, a la prensa dominicana y en las agencias de difusión de artículos, hubieran sido mucho mejores si yo hubiera tenido acceso a este libro de mi queridísimo amigo, sí, porque es amigo mío, y lo confieso con mucho honor y con mucha felicidad, José Azel. Por lo tanto, José Azel, voy a reducir mis palabras considerablemente, porque sé que hay personas que no están escuchándome en su propio idioma. Pero yo quiero al menos decir, ya que no puedo ir a los detalles, quiero decir algo directamente a José Azel. Mi amigo, mi colega, gracias por hablar con tanta propiedad del sagrado tema de la libertad. Muchos tal vez no crean demasiado o lo suficiente acerca del peligro, pero el peligro nos acecha. Refiriéndose a la obra de Nicolás Maquiavelo, autor no solo del famoso trabajo El Príncipe, sino de muchísimos otros estudios, y sobre todo una historia de Florencia. Yo soy historiador y cuando hay un libro de historia inmediatamente le meto mano. Refiriéndose a esa obra, Curcio Malaparte, en su trabajo Técnica del Golpe de Estado, dijo lo siguiente, o escribió lo siguiente: los tiempos a los que se refieren los argumentos, los ejemplos y la moral de El Príncipe demostraron una decadencia de la libertad pública y privada, de la dignidad del ciudadano y del respeto humano. Hasta ahí la cita de Malaparte, basándose en las palabras de Maquiavelo. Yo me atrevo a afirmar que todavía estamos enfrentando ese tipo de decadencia. Y ya finalmente, hace 3 años, el profesor, columnista de diarios y ensayista José Azel, y junto a su esposa, gran alpinista, en una generosidad sin límites, escribió sobre mí en un trabajo que me dedicaron 25 amigos. Cuando cumplí 75 años, acabo de cumplir 78. Y quiero decirte ya, en un estilo bien cubano, que cuando en tu artículo me llamaste maestro de maestros, te equivocaste, mi hermano. te equivocaste. Tú sí eres un maestro de maestros. Les presento, después de mi gran amigo y el gran académico Eduardo Lolo, les presento a José Azel sus ensayos sobre la libertad, porque quiero seguir aprendiendo. Gracias, mi querido maestro. Que Dios los bendiga a todos. Y viva Cuba libre.
Bueno, seguiré con mi asignación de hablar en inglés. Prefiero expresarme en español, sobre todo después de ver utilizar el idioma de una forma tan bonita. Pero bueno, tenemos un trabajo que hacer. I want to also welcome, but I saw that we have someone special here tonight, and Ambassador Martin Palouche, who was Václav Havel's ambassador to the UN and to the US, and one of the signers of the Charter 77 in the Czech Republic. So welcome, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you. The thing is that when you have a writer that has the ability to speak to intellectuals, like Martin, and has the ability to speak to the common man through a newspaper article and transmit that same information, that's the most powerful type of writing that anybody could aspire to. There's a lot of intelligent people that can't write in a way that ordinary people understand. And the ones that do generally are politicians that can't really have an intellectual discussion with a high-level intellectual. And Dr. Azel has the ability to do both. And that unique gift is part of what we're here to celebrate today. I got to tell you, just in hearing Dr. Ramos speaking, I'm going to buy not one book, I'm going to buy two, one for each one of my kids. Because one of the best legacies that we can leave is how to think and how to understand the world around us in that way. And I think it's critical for people, for young people, to understand this. But well, we don't just have one great professor. We have another one, and this one's a little tougher, because the toughest subject of all is literature. So to be acclaimed and presented by a literature professor is probably the highest honor that a writer can receive. So I leave you with one of our brightest minds, an eminent professor, multiple books, multiple articles, Dr. Eduardo Lolo. Doctor.
¿Qué problema? Porque el doctor Ramos dijo todo lo que yo quería decir. Ese es el problema cuando uno tiene que seguir a alguien tan brillante, tan profundo y a la par tan amigo de sus amigos y tan amigo de los principios de sus amigos, que lo dejan a uno sin palabras. A tal punto que dejé mi discurso allí. No voy a repetir lo que él dijo. Voy a chismear con ustedes. Y les voy a chismear de cómo escribe Azel. ¿Y por qué escribe Azel? ¿De dónde saca sus raíces? No porque me los haya dicho, sino porque me los ha dicho su literatura. Porque sus libros hablan por él de dónde está el génesis de cada uno de ellos. Porque más allá del trabajo solitario, perfecto, que realiza él con la escritura, tiene tras de sí unas raíces que nos llevan a lo más profundo del uso del idioma español en nuestra lengua. Y empiezo el chisme sacando de dónde él saca su técnica literaria. Su técnica literaria parte de finales del siglo XIX, no porque él ha estado vivo en esa época, okay, vamos a estar claros, cuando toda una serie de recursos técnicos desconocidos en el 18 comenzaron a tener vida. El linotipo, estoy seguro que muchos de ustedes no tienen la menor idea de qué cosa es un linotipo. Un linotipo, antes del linotipo se escribían los textos letra a letra. El linotipo es como una máquina de escribir donde salen las líneas, ya las letras unidas en una raíz común. Y así se arman lo que se llaman las planas, que ya no es palabra, letra a letra. Y también la rotativa, cosa de que ya no había que poner el papel, pasar la prensa y salir para la próxima, sino que la rotativa, como su nombre lo indica, un rollo de papel que todas esas planas iban saliendo fácilmente. ¿A qué viene esto? A que el linotipo y la rotativa, entre otros aspectos, abarataron mucho los precios de los libros, los periódicos y las revistas. Al abaratarse los precios, se abarató el precio al público. Subieron los lectores. Todo el mundo quería leer el periódico del día. Todo el mundo quería leer las revistas de la semana. Pero los gacetilleros, que es como se les llamaba entonces a los periodistas, no dieron abasto. Además de que trabajaban muy mecánicamente. Trabajaban siguiendo siempre un patrón llamado el lead, que era qué, cómo, cuándo, dónde. Llegaron los escritores entonces a darle alimento a los linotipos y a las rotativas, dándole una mano a los gacetilleros. Llegaron los escritores, pero trajeron una valija con ellos, la valija de los géneros literarios. Especialmente entonces inocularon al periodismo el ensayo. De momento ya los periódicos no eran solamente las noticias del día, alguna que otra columna muy superficial y por supuesto los cómics. Los cómics siguieron, pero los escritores empezaron a darle calidad literaria a cada uno de esos géneros. Hasta una nota de prensa simple ya tenía una característica literaria. Pero la vida es una noria. La palabra dio una vuelta en la noria. Y los escritores que salvaron la vida al periodismo comenzaron a recibir la influencia del periodismo. Influencia fundamental. Hay que escribir un número exacto de palabras. Usted puede cambiar el tono, usted puede cambiar el ritmo, usted puede cambiar el vocabulario. Lo que no puede cambiar es el número de palabras que caben en una plana. Es más, ya a finales del siglo, con el advenimiento de la técnica de la ilustración, se podía publicar hasta fotos, se redujeron los espacios de los textos. Los escritores que escribían 10, 15, 20 páginas para un ensayo, para un artículo, no podía ser. Pero tampoco podían escribir con la superficialidad de un artículo. Aprenden los escritores a escribir con menos, mejor. Donde la cantidad y la calidad no tenían que tener una relación exacta. Logramos entonces que el artículo se convierta en un mini ensayo. La diferencia es que el artículo simplemente da información y opinión. El ensayo nos aporta el pensar. Luego de un ensayo, sea grande, pequeño, hay que pensar. Es el objetivo fundamental. No es indoctrinación, es simplemente estudiar, que es el verbo latino que indica que se está ansioso de conocimiento. Un lector de ensayos está ansioso de conocimiento. No puede vivir si cada día no tiene un nuevo conocimiento. Surge entonces el mini ensayo. Eso es lo que escribe este culpable que nos hace creer que son columnas periodísticas cuando no lo son. Nos está engañando, nos está dando gato por liebre, pero esta es una liebre que nos permite ir más allá de las palabras. Es más, desde el punto de vista técnico, van a encontrar ustedes en estos lo que yo llamo mini ensayos, de Azel, la voluntad de estilo modernista. ¿En qué reside la voluntad de estilo modernista? En que tiene que ser un lenguaje bello, que tiene que dar placer en la lectura. Ya la prensa no da solamente información y opinión, la prensa da también el gusto de la buena lectura. Y esos son las supuestas columnas de Azel. Buenas lecturas que dan gusto. Se encuentra esa voluntad de estilo no solamente en encontrar la palabra que sirve de perfecto alicate para llegar a la idea. Es también un cosmético, es también un vestuario. Las palabras vienen entonces bien vestidas, bien arregladas, como esas modelos cuando salen en las pasarelas. Así nos llegan las palabras, así nos llegan las ideas. Y hay más, porque el mini ensayo hace que el lenguaje sea también música. Yo no sé si tú tocas aunque sea las maracas, pero aunque no toque las maracas, vemos que la voluntad de estilo modernista nos indica que también tiene que haber un sonido grato en las palabras y que las palabras imbricadas tienen que tener un ritmo que llega entonces a la musicalidad del párrafo, donde entonces cada párrafo es una frase musical. No sé si ustedes sabían estos trucos que él está utilizando. Ya lo saben. Me he dado de chivato hoy. Pero lo importante es que cada vez disfruten más y sepan lo que están disfrutando. Y sepan que ese vocabulario que va en cascada tan fácilmente llega al lector es el trabajo muy arduo del escritor solo con su soledad frente a la pantalla del ordenador, pero sabiendo que más allá del ordenador están ustedes, estoy yo, estamos todos. Él nos habla a cada uno de nosotros a través de la técnica literaria. Nunca entonces ya él está solo. Nunca más el escritor está solo cuando llega al lector y sabe que el lector está apreciando verdaderamente el esfuerzo por llegar a la idea más clara, usando el lenguaje más prístino, más gallardo, más perfecto, más directo. Porque la palabra que no llegue a la mente y el alma no es palabra, es simplemente un sonido muerto en el aire. No van a encontrar nada de eso en Azel. En Azel está esa palabra, está musical, está esa idea. Llega a la libertad. Y uno se pregunta, ¿y por qué ese esfuerzo de él de trabajar la libertad cuando la mayor parte de su vida ha vivido en libertad? Llegó muy niño. Es muy poco lo que él conoce de la falta de libertad. Pero como todo exiliado, tiene una doble personalidad. Él, a la señora, el señorito, yo, estamos aquí, pero somos en Cuba. No hay diferencia alguna en el alma del emigrado, en el alma del exiliado, entre ser y estar. Él ha estado en múltiples lugares, ha subido montañas, ha bajado a los abismos, ha visitado muchas ciudades, habla muchas lenguas, está en todas partes, pero es en un solo lugar, en Cuba. Y en Cuba no hay libertad. Si no hay libertad, entonces él se encarga de escribir sobre la libertad para que aquellos que hoy sufren su falta logren alcanzarla y muy en particular logren mantenerla. Él escribe hoy, entonces, puesta la vista en el futuro. Es mi único sueño de que esa libertad que él ha estudiado, esa libertad que él nos presenta, esa libertad que hoy gozamos aquí, pero que sufrimos allá, sea para todos los cubanos los que están aquí, los que están allá y los que siempre somos, donde quiera que estemos, en Cuba. Muchas gracias por ese libro, hermano.
Okay. As I'm continuing, como voy a continuar mi trabajo de hacerlo todo en esta parte en inglés, I'm going to try what was said in the last two speakers. It's so beautiful. But I'm going to try to synthesize it in English with the help of the language. Whatever we could say with 3 words in English, we could say with 3 pages in Spanish. So we're going to try and do that. But what matters really, in other words, is the concept. One of the things that Dr. Lolo told us is how a good writer, in his view as a professor of literature, a good writer, like Jose, can, in a way, sing to you. You enjoy the actual words. They rhyme. They have a certain flow to it. And I could see that if you read these books, you'll see that in Dr. Azel's writings. But as I said at the beginning, that isn't enough to be the type of writer that Dr. Azel has become. Because you could have a nice flow if you're going to be writing poetry. Roses are red, violets are blue, and what have you. But it takes a different kind of mind to, in addition of giving you that delight, to recognize certain key ideas. And first of all, credit the original authors of those ideas in every single work, because there's a lot of intellectual borrowing and plagiarism in academia. But Dr. Azel, as you know, always begins with crediting whoever, throughout the long history of humanity, first espoused that concept. And that's something that's not only admirable, but it gives the reader a little clue as to where he can get more information on this subject that he's condensing into an article. And that is, for those who are the intellectual curious, it's a great, and something that we really agradecemos, that we're very grateful for. But then comes the last part of it, that hopefully we can discuss today. The last part of it, which is, if you're writing, as he has chosen to do, the principal subject matter being freedom, the relationship of man and state, the relationship of man to man. In that concept, most writers are giving you indoctrination, which is what was said here in Spanish. They're giving you a dogma. But the best writers don't give you a dogma, aren't telling you what to do. They're observing human qualities that enable you, with that knowledge, to be able to decipher what is dogma, and particularly what is dangerous dogma, from what is a proper exercise of our discretion. What differentiates us from animals is the ability to reason at an advanced level. And governments that take that away from you are reducing you to the levels of animals. Something as basic as that. And I thought about it as you were drawing this distinction between this concept that Dr. Azel brings and the indoctrination. And Adam Smith, what today many call the father of capitalism. But Adam Smith said he wasn't an economist, and he certainly didn't use the term capitalism. He was observing simply that when people in nations are free to make their own decisions, the economy prospers. Then the indoctrinators that came later, decades later, then gave them labels and started talking about different systems, and the communist system, the socialist system. But he was just making an observation. If you're armed with that observation that Adam Smith made in the 18th century, when you later read in the 19th century some German guy coming up with this new theoretical system, you wouldn't get fooled by it. And you'd really understand that the difference between a Democrat, not in the terms of the party, a freedom-loving person, and a communist is simple. Ronald Reagan explained it best. A communist is someone who has read the Communist Manifesto and Karl Marx. A liberal, freedom-loving person is someone who has read it and understands it. And that's the key difference. Dr. Azel, thank you for letting us understanding it and giving us the tools to be able to understand the difference. Ladies and gentlemen, the man you all came to see, the writer that doesn't pass, Dr. José Azel.
I must confess I'm a little bit overwhelmed by all the beautiful words, and it's really quite an honor and a pleasure to be here. So thank you, Marcell and Marcos and Eduardo and Tony. I appreciate all of you being here. My colleagues have chosen to present in Spanish, and I do realize there are a number of people here that do not speak Spanish. So with your indulgence, I'm going to switch to English or maybe a little bit of Spanglish. I don't know, but that's what I'll try to do. But in parentheses, if libertad is the word that we use for liberty, do you realize that we do not have a word in Spanish for freedom? And the idea then comes is the fact that we do not have a word for freedom, a specific word for freedom. Does that have any kind of implications? Does the fact that we do not pay as much attention to freedom as perhaps we should, what does that mean? What are the implications, if any, of not having a specific word for freedom? The two concepts are similar, but they're not identical. What I would like to do is to share with you some ideas of freedom, and then perhaps we can open it up for questions. I think that's going to be the much more interesting part. Freedom is subjective. It is personal. It's a personal state of affairs. On the other hand, liberty is much more about our connection to the state. It's not a personal, it's a collective approach. One way to think about it is that we demand liberty so that we can enjoy our freedoms. But they're two somewhat different concepts. I would argue that in Latin America we have valiantly and forever fought for liberty. Bolívar, San Martín, Martí, and the like. But perhaps we have never really fought for freedom. And that perhaps is something that I want to develop a little bit with you. I'll give you an anecdote here. English is my professional language, and I tend to write in English, and then I will have someone help me with the translations later on. In 2010, I wrote an article precisely on this topic, trying to distinguish between freedom and liberty. And I sent the article at that time to my translator, some of you might know him, Dr. Eugenio Ñañez, en paz descanse, and having translated the article, and a couple of days later, he called me and says, Joe, we got a problem. What's the problem? I don't know how to translate this. You're making a distinction between liberty and freedom, and in Spanish, we don't have a word for freedom. So how do I do this? How do we do this article? And it was quite a challenge, and that was the first time that it really hit me that we don't have a word. I think we ended up, I'm working from memory, but I think we ended up by putting a capital libertad with a capital when we were talking about liberty and lowercase when we were talking about freedom or something like that, so to make the article make sense. So let's sort of look at that concept of liberty a little bit more in detail. Academics tend to think of liberty in two ways: liberty from and liberty to. When we're talking about liberty from, we're talking about liberty from oppression. We are free from not being
that doesn't warrant that we're going to make the right decisions in our lives. We simply warrants that we are going to be free to make those decisions without interference from somebody else. Freedom from emphasizes equality of rights, equality of opportunities, but not necessarily equality of outcomes. The fact that we are equal before the law really implies that there is going to be inequality of outcomes. Equality before the law is going to lead us to have inequality of outcomes. On the other hand, freedom too holds that the state must interfere in order to provide people the opportunities that they want. That is the socialist version of freedom. Our version of freedom is freedom from. But we have to understand and recognize that that freedom from does lead to inequality. And it gives the opening to the socialist vision of freedom too, which requires the state to get involved. Another question that we ask our freedom, or we can ask ourselves here, and I'm going to sort of leave you with a handful of questions to discuss. Does everyone want freedom? Is freedom something that is a universally desired value? And the short answer to that is no. Freedom is not wanted everywhere. There are many societies that put security ahead of freedom. There are many societies that are perfectly willing to give up freedom in order to be more secure. In fact, we could actually be in that same boat. If you recall, after the September 11th attacks, we passed a number of very, very restrictive laws that took away a lot of our freedoms. And we did so, I suppose, because we were looking for security. So that is something that we must always, I guess, be alert. We can also think of freedom as three types of freedom: national freedom, political freedom, and individual freedom. Countries like North Korea or Cuba, they can be said to have national freedom in the sense that they're countries that supposedly can make decisions, national decisions. They certainly do not have political freedom, or individual freedom, but that is part of the problem. Now, the United States has done a pretty good job of putting all these three freedoms together, but they are not seldom found together. Some years ago, I used to travel to Hong Kong quite frequently, and Hong Kong was an incredible city at the time, but it's a territory that has never, ever had any kind of democratic rule. It has never been a democracy or anything close to that. And yet, Hong Kong is typically cited as being number one in economic freedom in the world. So that, to me, is an example of why we have to think about those terms of economic freedom and political freedom. Another question that I will sort of throw out there to you is, where does freedom come from? Where does it come from? And I guess the short answer, or the convenient answer, is that freedom comes from God. Well, that's okay, but if God is omniscient and knows exactly what is going to happen, then almost by definition, if everything is predetermined, there can be no freedom. Predetermination or predestination and freedom are really two incompatible topics. So I'm not sure that we can sort of say that freedom comes from God. Another interesting topic that I will put out there for you is, why do we object to freedom? And I know this is a political season, and I don't want to get political, but why do we object to freedom? And the fact is that we do object to freedom. Now, by definition, this is not because I'm saying it, but by definition, an expanded government is a diminution of freedom. anything that we ask government to do for us, even the most necessary national defense, if you will, anything we require of government, we have to pay for with a reduction in our freedoms. And if I can leave you with one thought, that is the one thought I think that I want to leave you with, that anything that we ask of government necessarily requires a diminution of our freedoms. And yet, a very large segment of the population wants additional government services. We always see ourselves saying, you know, why doesn't the government do this, or doesn't the government do that? In my old age, I have become a little bit of a libertarian philosophically, because I simply want very little government and to expand our freedom. And the final question that I sort of want to put out there for you is, what, if any, is the relationship between freedom and democracy? And there is a relationship between freedom and democracy, but they're not the same. They're not identical concepts. In fact, our founding fathers in the United States were terrified of democracy. They did not like democracy at all. The founding fathers were really, really very concerned with democracy. And the Constitution was written to advance freedom, not to advance democracy. In fact, and some of you may not be aware of this, the word democracy was deliberately left out by the founding fathers of the founding documents. The word democracy is not in the Declaration of Independence, and it's not in the Constitution of the United States. That was also something that they were really concerned with. Anyway, I've sort of wanted to give you some ideas and maybe open it up for your questions, which to me is the most interesting part of this. So I'd like to open it up for questions, if you will. Anyone? Sin pena, no castigan aquí, no hay ningún castigo ni nada por el estilo, ¿no?
Bueno, doctor, yo le digo una pregunta.
Diga.
Y quería ver el doctor Ramos, porque este concepto de que la libertad es divina, viene de Dios, y que, como acabas de decir, bueno, pero entonces si todo está preordinado, no puede haber libertad. Quería ver el concepto del doctor Ramos, porque entras un poco en la parte teológica.
Claro.
Porque si de la parte teológica crees que todo está predeterminado, eso tiene sentido. Si de la parte teológica determinas que Dios le da a los seres humanos libertad, su propia voluntad, entonces sí encaja que venga de cómo fue el caso en la Declaración de Independencia de los Estados Unidos.
Es que son dos asuntos que hemos tratado de relacionar demasiado.
Okay.
Hemos tratado de relacionar demasiado
Me quedo aquí para poder compartir.
la iglesia del Estado. Yo soy martiano en eso. No hay pueblos felices con la unión de la iglesia y el Estado. Y eso se puede llevar a una serie de consideraciones muy importantes. Es decir, si estamos hablando de libertad, si estamos hablando de libertad, freedom, liberty y todo lo demás, y queremos meter ahí a la religión, yo felicito a mi amigo José Azel que no hace eso. Es decir, cuando él nos ofrece un ensayo, porque son ensayos breves, como dice mi colega de la academia, mi ilustre amigo Lolo, esos mini ensayos que son súper ensayos en un sentido, en contenido. Yo sé que la extensión es una cosa y el contenido. No son sermones, no son elaboraciones teológicas. Todo eso dentro de las libertades existe. La libertad de religión. Ahora, si tratamos de los religiosos como yo, que mi mujer es más religiosa que yo, debo advertir eso, porque sinceramente yo soy un religioso que trato de ser lo más que puedo, ¿no? Y pedirle al Señor que me ayude. Si nosotros queremos imponer la teología romana, la teología calvinista, nos vamos a meter en una clase de rollo, mi querido Marcell Felipe. que tiene unas implicaciones tremendas. Es decir, nosotros, cada país tiene una tradición religiosa. Este país, aunque hoy en día vienen personas de todo el mundo, si tú ves desde el punto de vista cultural, es un país de tradición protestante. Punto. Eso no está sujeto a discusión. Cuba, aunque ahora hay muchos protestantes, es un país de tradición católica. Pero vamos a tratar nosotros ahora, intentar que la libertad, la democracia de Cuba sea una democracia católica o protestante, y entonces los conceptos religiosos. Muy buena pregunta, pero es una pregunta que requiere una explicación muy larga. De un pobre guajiro del interior de Cuba, como yo. ¿Qué puedo decir? Muy buenas preguntas y muy buenos comentarios. Ahora, eso sí, cuidado con eso. Es verdad que uno tiene principios religiosos que uno quiere que se defiendan. Y en la arena política hay cosas que nosotros queremos luchar en contra de ellas. Pero recordemos esto. Estados Unidos no es una teocracia. Y si es una teocracia, tremendo problema. Y termino con algo que no sé cómo lo verá mi gran amigo ahora, porque yo debo esa amistad a Diego, que como tú sabes es jefe mío ahora. Pero quiero decirle lo siguiente. Yo me inclino teológicamente por formación al calvinismo, pero no quiero que Calvino se mude para mi cuadra.
Gracias, Tony. Sí, un comentario, les voy a coger las preguntas un segundito, pero quisiera un comentario sobre esto de libertad que no lo hice y quisiera hacerlo. Desafortunadamente, tenemos un problema. El autoritarismo está extendiéndose en el planeta en este momento. Los últimos estudios, and I'm switching back and forth the languages, but I'm sorry. The last reports show that in the last year, 60 countries lost freedom. And only 20% of the population of the world today can be said to live in freedom. That is to say, 80% of the people of the planet do not live in freedom. That is concerning. I'm sorry, we have some questions back there.
Jose, you have addressed the cause of Cuba Libre in many facets.
Mm-hmm.
In my humble opinion, and Reverend, I am so humble that I expect to inherit the earth. The issue of Cuba Libre is like a coin with two sides. You have addressed the issue of Cuba Libre itself, the island, as well as the attacks that we in El Exilio receive every day. You are aware that there's a tendency now among U.S. intellectuals, my colleagues in academia, to propose the quote-unquote China model, or to propose the Vietnamese model, whereas you and I still favor regime change and Cuba Libre. On the other hand, the other side of the coin, the Exilio, there is an institution right here in Miami that all of us support with our tax contributions, by the way, that constantly attacks us, sometimes not so openly, sometimes in a very, very veiled fashion. Like we are, the institution just released an alleged poll. We are intransigentes, we are frozen in the Cold War. And one of the authors, in fact, wrote a book a number of years ago. The first line in that book is, "Nothing is normal in Cuban Miami." Can you imagine writing a book about the Jewish community in Brooklyn, and the first line would be, "Nothing is normal among Jews in Brooklyn." Or writing a book about Mexican Americans in LA, "Nothing is normal among Mexican Americans in LA." But they get away with it. Okay? You have addressed a number of these issues. In my humble opinion, again, we are at fault because we do not have an anti-defamation league. From the top of your head, and you have addressed these issues kind of in oblique fashion at times, can you summarize how can we face that kind of, on the one hand, criticism, because we continue to aspire to a Cuba Libre, and on the other hand are all these academicians, including a former mentor of mine from a university in the state of Pennsylvania, who shall remain unnamed, who favors, quote unquote, the Vietnamese model or the Chinese model, meaning Communist Party will continue in power, but there will be some kind of liberation of the economy, etc.
Well,
Thank you, sir.
there's a lot there, but and I don't want to get too political here. I think part of our mission, or what I think is part of my mission, is to advance the concept of freedom. If we focus on advancing freedom and all it stands for, then almost by definition, those models, the Chinese model, the Vietnamese model, do not come into play, or cannot come into play. So part of, I think, what I would like to do is always emphasize that concept of freedom. Because in my mind, happiness is simply not possible if you're not free. You can be richer, you can be in China, you can be richer, you can be wealthier, but without freedom, in my mind, happiness is simply not possible. Yes, sir.
Jose, I spent 2.5 years in Cuba fighting for freedom. We lost, but we fought. And it's very clear to me and the people who fought with me what freedom is all about. It has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with any of the stuff. Freedom is something, the right to do what you think that you have to do. And that's it. So that's me very clear. Anyone who stood 2.5 years fighting Castro will know exactly what freedom is all about, and that we don't have it.
Well, and that's why I wrote a book specifically on freedom, because I want to clarify what that concept is and what it means, and without any of the political implications that are part of that. So, sir?
Jose, could I be free with no liberty? Could I live in Cuba today and be free?
No, I would say no. And again, it's an interesting question because the two concepts are similar but not identical. When we talk about liberty, we're talking about that relationship between us and the state, and whatever that relationship may be. But freedom is about something else. Freedom is our ability to do things. Is a very personal thing. I guess someone metaphysically might say that you could be free as a monk. In Tibet, for example, I spent some time in Tibet visiting with the monks, and I guess a monk can think he's free whether he's not free or not. So if we don't get metaphysical, that's the only way I can think of. You have to have political liberty in order to be able to be free.
Yeah, I was going to comment on your capacity to reach a broader audience in this changing media landscape. You've been writing for many years now, and my understanding is that fewer of your articles are getting into popular outlets and more are going to your email list. Is that correct?
Well, I have an email list that I send my articles to. I have the Azel Perspective, which is a publication that I put out every Monday with one of my articles. I think we have 6,000-7,000 subscribers to that. And then I also publish in some newspapers. El Nuevo Herald sometimes will publish me and on.
Yeah, just my question is, are they more or less friendly towards your perspective, and especially when it comes to the Spanish language outlets, which unfortunately I suspect are not friendly to your perspective?
None of them are friendly. None of them are friendly. I am sorry to say, locally, the Miami Herald in English publishes me rarely. El Nuevo Herald is a little bit better. They publish me much more frequently. But no, there is a prejudiced against talking about freedom. I would say in the media, and that's unfortunate. But I think that's part of what we do. Carmen.
I hate to go back to something that was already sort of settled, but how do you feel about, we have been endowed by our Creator with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Okay.
How do you feel about that? Because there are already said.
It's a beautiful sentence in the Declaration of Independence. I mean,
Exactly. You said that he says no God, this and that, and that goes back to we receive everything from God and not from any man, and no one can never, take our liberty away because it comes, we're born with it from whatever we come from.
and I happen to believe that liberty is something that is not given to us. Liberty is not something that a government grants us by any means. Liberty is something that we are born with. My question having to do with that was a little bit different in terms of how I apply God into that. But no, I am certainly a believer in life, liberty, and true justice. I think we had other questions here. Yes, ma'am. Oh.
Yes,
Oh.
go back to
I know who you are now. I can't see you.
one was to follow up on his question regarding the stifling of ideas and the prohibition of language that we've witnessed in the last 2 years, especially one in the media and just in society in general, and how that affects you as a writer. And the second opinion that I wanted was how you feel regards to the loss of freedom that we experience with the premise of a pandemic, and how much freedom we've lost, that most of which I don't think we will ever regain based on that premise. How do you feel, what your thoughts are?
Well, I think part of what I'm trying to do is alert my readers that there is a reduction in our freedoms, and not just with the pandemic, as I mentioned, following September 11, we passed a number of laws that really restrict our freedom, and I guess the argument or the excuse was that this is to provide you security, to protect you, and that is something that we have to be very aware of. We are being challenged by that. I also mentioned, and I guess it's worth repeating, I said that's the one thought that I want to leave you, is that anything we ask of government, anything, necessarily implies a reduction of freedom. So in my later years, as I mentioned, I have become a philosophical libertarian because I don't want to give up any of my freedoms. I simply do not. So I am prepared to have a very small government that does very little, or what the founding fathers wanted, a government that protects our life, liberty, and property, and nothing else. But I am afraid that's not the way our society is going. And if that is your point, our society is going for a very, very expanded government, more and more intrusive, which again implies less and less freedom. Sir.
Joe, not speaking Spanish, but recognizing your esteemed colleagues, giving you the respect by having the skill, being able to speak the layman, and also the literary, philosophical writers. Have you thought, maybe you don't want to address it, have you thought about a political career? And if so, what would that look like? Not
at all. There is absolutely no way that I would. No, there have been probes over the years that people have asked me and have a look, and I have testified in Congress a couple of times and that kind of a thing. But no, absolutely not. The one position I would take is as emperor. But if I cannot be emperor, I'm not interested. That's about the one role I would take. I'm sorry. Yeah. Sí.
Quería hacerle una pregunta,
45. Yo he visto el deterioro y la pérdida de la libertad y de la libertad y de la independencia total de los niños.
¿De los niños?
De los niños.
Ajá.
¿Por qué? Porque no hay familia. El deterioro de la familia ha creado un tsunami muy grande en todos los países. Fíjense que los países más estables, la familia es importante. Siempre están unidos. Entonces yo le digo, cuando un niño nace libre.
Sí, por definición yo creo que nace libre. Por definición nace libre. Ahora bien, no retiene esa libertad, desafortunadamente. Y lo que usted menciona es una realidad. Ahora bien, yo no estoy seguro si hay algún papel para el Estado en esa realidad. Es decir, esa deterioración de la familia, no creo que es un papel del Estado meterse en eso, pero puede crear algunos ambientes o puede crear algún medio ambiente para...
Pero yo no hablo del Estado, yo hablo de la misma familia.
Correcto, pero ¿cuál sería el papel del Estado, si alguno? Instruir.
Porque la educación es de las raíces.
Sí, educación sería lo más
Y ahí
importante.
es donde usted quiere su libertad.
Joe, what's your perspective on liberty and freedom in Cuba in the future? In 5 minutes.
Oh, wow. Well, I have written a number of articles on that. And today I am quite, and I hate to say this, but I'm quite pessimistic. Because freedom requires a level of citizenship that is very profound, very committed to freedom and liberty. And I am afraid that after 60-some years of totalitarian rule, that understanding of freedom is just not there in the population. But I say that as an outsider, as someone here that has not been to Cuba in 62 years. So I don't have an intimate knowledge. But from what I see, interviews that we used to do at the university, I don't think that there is that a civil society that is capable of sustaining freedom. So I suspect that even if there is a change in regime, for obra y gracia del Espíritu Santo, there might be a change in regime of some sort, the question becomes, will it lead to democracy or will it lead to something else? And maybe it will not lead to another form of totalitarianism, but if I had to guess, it would lead to a typical Latin American strongman dictatorship or some stuff like that. That's not a good outlook from my point of view. Of course, Marcell.
Answer something to that effect, and also to, I guess as a follow-up to that conversation. I think that really depends, and it depends in large part on what we do here in Miami, because no other country that I can think of, coming from the communist bloc, has had 25% of their population living in the United States, developing in the United States, and having the kind of political power that we have in the United States. And if I may, we always tend to think as ourselves, whether you're Cuban or whether you're Hungarian or wherever you are, as very idiocentric. Our country, we have these traits. In reality, most human beings are more or less the same, and they react the same under similar circumstances. And to point this out is a play I was reading the other days. In the play, there is a dissident who is a childhood friend of a state security officer. And because they're childhood friends, they have the ability behind closed doors to talk openly. And the state security officer says, I really don't know why you do this. You're putting your life at risk, your family at risk, and ultimately, even if you succeed, it will be impossible to rebuild this. Look at the destruction. The city is literally falling apart. Look at the character and the moral decay in our society. it would be impossible to rebuild that. We've lost the concept of citizenship. We've lost the concept of morality. How are you going to build a society out of that? That play gives me a lot of hope. You know why? Because that play isn't written in Havana about Cuba today. It was written in the late 70s by a playwright called Václav Havel about Prague. And if you go to Prague today, it has nothing on Paris. I mean, Paris got nothing on Prague. It's a beautiful city. If you go to Hungary, it's a beautiful developing country, flourishing country. So communism, that lack of liberty that we talked about, brings out the worst in people, tears everything down. If you manage to have an opening to freedom, people respond positively. Of course, those are the two ends. How do you get there, and all the steps in between, which could divert you into a Vietnamese model, a Chinese model, a Russian model, which is probably the one that I fear the most in the case of Cuba. But it all goes back to the same belief and concept that we talked about when we talked about the Christian part, which I think was a little bit misunderstood. What I meant on that side is whether or not you believe in God. If you believe in God and you believe that God gives you free will, then the concept that it's a God-given right is perfectly compatible, because God's giving you free will. It's compatible with freedom. But even if you don't believe in God, it's the same concept that you talked about, where it's not something given to you by the state. It's what other philosophers that are not Christian refer to as natural rights. And it's your condition as a human being. You're born, as I said a little earlier, with the ability to think. What distinguishes you from an animal, the ability to reason at an advanced level. That, when you're born with that, whether it's God-given or not, depending on your theology, is what differentiates you from an animal, and it's what makes you, is that freedom. Even if you're part of a culture that gives, because this concept of freedom is always, it's not black and white in the sense that how much are you willing to give to the state, right? And there are some societies that give more to the state willingly. In Europe, it's a good example compared to the United States, willingly in exchange for other securities. But even that, you're making that conscious decision. You don't want it imposed upon you. And so I do think it's a universal concept. It's a part of what makes us human, with the human beings, whether it's God-given or natural. And I think that's why I have faith that under the right circumstances, Cuba will flourish and we will become a democracy again. That's what I'm working for anyways.
I hope you're right, and that's what we all hope for. Mayito, I'm going to add to that a little in a minute, but let me get this. Mayito, go ahead.
Let me speak in Spanish.
¿Cómo no?
I deal a lot with Cuba, inside of Cuba, in a very frequent way. And I have noticed that a lot of people inside of Cuba, young people, are changing. They are looking for something new. And I cannot say that the people inside of Cuba 5 years ago are the same people as today. There is a lot of youth people that want to know more, that want to know how to change, and they are improving. So I think that there is a lot to be said for the people, or the new people in Cuba changing.
And you're absolutely right. And I think there's something I want to say about that, but also about the person that is saying it. Mayito was one of the youngest members of the brigade that landed in Cuba in 1961, and he's still here, he's still fighting for that. I think he was 17 years old when he landed, so that's another question, I think, up here. I saw another hand, and I don't know where it was from. Yeah, Raul.
I believe that freedom is an innate condition to human beings, and it will prevail. You say where it's coming from, it's innate. It's born to the human being, and it will prevail. That's what we all aspire to have freedom.
But Raul, there are many societies around the world, and I could give you a list where they do not value freedom as you and I do. They value security, and they are willing to give up freedom for security. We did that after September 11th. We gave up freedom for security. So
We maintain freedom, except you're in a state of war, you have to fight a war. But if you always want, that's innate in human beings, you can't take that away from them. You're born with it. That's how
Well, again, and that's why I wrote the whole book on freedom, because, you know, we need to think about it, and I don't know if you're talking about political freedom or, well, but it's different. I mean, you know, there is national freedom in North Korea. The nation can decide. The national freedom is there. No other freedom.
I see this back and forth, and I think that we always go to the same. Everybody tries to be politically correct. Everybody tries to don't bother your neighbor, and that's fine. But we are living moments that we have to be political, we have to be theological as much as we can, because we have to alert the young people who are dying, they're losing their values. That's more important than to bother somebody, to push them a little bit, to somebody who don't want to talk to me. I'm sorry. I'm fighting for survival in the world, not just in the United States. Let me explain to you. The bottom of everything is that we have been disconnected from our Creator. Those of you who might not believe it, I think I will advise you that you go and visit a book that is the one who has been more recognized, more translated for about 4,000 years. If you do that, I think it's not because God just visited and tried with open heart not to convince anybody, to find what it might be in there that has been, still is available, still is discussed. There is so many Christians in the world. There are so many Jewish people in the world. Those of them together, it's a big percentage more than is just telling anyone who has too common sense to investigate a little bit about it. So if you go and you connect with that book, you will find a lot of things that are related to what we are fighting. And we are fighting with blind here, with like a rope around our eyes, giving just back to each other. But the root is the root. That is what.
Thank you. But let me.
He's talking about.
But let me go.
I just mentioned one psalm. Psalm 139 says, when I repeat it in Spanish, this is the one that comes. Mi embrión vieron tus ojos, y en ellos fueron formadas todas las cosas. En ellos fueron escritas todas las cosas que después fueron formadas. You know what they are talking about here? They are talking about DNA. Huh? 4,000 years ago.
Okay, but let me go back to the question here, so I can
My recommendation, this is a very good podium to treat and to start to develop more things in the future.
Thank you. Raul, let me, you ask about freedom, and you say that everybody loves freedom, but I made a statement when I was talking about freedom that a lot of people, and maybe some in this room, they want more government. They want more government action. And by definition, and I want to really emphasize this, by definition, any more government, any government reduces our freedom. That's simply true. Now, you say people want freedom, but I hear people wanting more government, which to me means people want less freedom. So I would encourage you to think along those lines, that every time we want government to do something, we have to be aware that we pay for that with our freedom. I will take one more question if there is, because I know people are getting hungry, they want to have dinner. Anybody else? Well,
How was your trip on the Grand Canyon?
Oh. Well, it was wonderful. We spent 4 months in Montana, and then we spent 17 days in a raft going down the Grand Canyon. 17 days sleeping on a sleeping bag, peeing on a bucket. You know, it was rough. Every night putting up a tent, every morning taking the tent down. It was very difficult. And what was difficult also is that when you're going the Grand Canyon, when you land and you're going to do a hike, because you're in a canyon, the hikes are vertical. So you are really, really hiking very vertical. So at 74, it wasn't easy. It was Thank you all for being here with us now.